Raise a glass. Wilson Fisk in the MCU, baby! Despite literally being one of the biggest villains in Marvel's catalog, due to licensing agreements after Daredevil's cancellation on Netflix, Fisk had remained in relative obscurity. But now he's in the MCU, and we couldn't be more excited.
It's a hell of a freaking light show. You're gonna love this.
If for some reason you didn't watch Daredevil, and if not, shame on you, you may be a little bit confused as to who this guy is and what he does. So we thought we'd put together a video about 15 things that even the biggest Kingpin fans didn't know about the character. Let's go. Going back to the very beginning, Wilson Fisk, aka the Kingpin, made his first comic book appearance in The Amazing Spider-Man number 50 in July of 1967, which follows the Spider-Man No More storyline, where Peter Parker quits being a superhero, which Fisk sees as the perfect time to seize control of organized crime in New York. Like most good things in life, Fisk was created by writer Stan Lee and artist John Romita Sr., with Romita drawing on multiple different people for inspiration. The main people who acted as inspiration for the design of his face were Robert Middleton and Edward Arnold, while his physical appearance was based on Casablanca actor Sidney Greenstreet, who was also the inspiration for a less flattering character, Jabba the Hutt. But for the personality of Kingpin, the Marvel writers looked towards two other people. The first of them being gangster Al Capone, who to many in Chicago was seen as a respected businessman who donated to charity, but in truth was the biggest mobster in the city that operated a massive racketeering syndicate. Capone, who claimed to be a second-hand furniture salesman, reportedly earned the equivalent of $1.4 billion through racketeering and bootlegging. This inspired Marvel to create a character who operated in the shadows as a criminal mastermind, but pretended to be a legitimate and benevolent businessman. However, instead of being beaten by the likes of Spider-Man or Daredevil, Capone was taken down by a more terrifying entity, the IRS. But Capone wasn't the only person to inspire Fisk, with Sherlock Holmes' main rival Moriarty also being an influence. And the 1994 Spider-Man series even paid reference to this by calling him Wilson Moriarty before he adopted the name Fisk. Parallels can also be drawn to another bald, evil genius who owns a massive corporation and has diabolical plans for the world, Jeff Bezos. Also Lex Luthor, with Fisk reportedly inspiring some iterations of the character. Now, while Fisk may not have any superpowers, the man is still extremely dangerous, hence why he's able to go toe-to-toe with the likes of Spider-Man and give the web-slinger a run for his money. Fisk is incredibly strong and significantly more durable than the average human, possessing remarkable strength that gives him the ability to punch dents into concrete, throw a fella across a room, rip a man's arm off, or even pop a dude's head like the Mountain in Game of Thrones. But it's not just his sheer strength that makes him so dangerous, with him mastering many forms of armed and unarmed combat, especially sumo wrestling, with his signature move being the bear hug. And, as you saw in Daredevil, if you ever embarrass him in front of VANESSA, he'll crush your head with a car door, so maybe don't.
Put him in a car.
Fisk started training from a young age after being bullied for his obesity before coming under the employ of mobster Don Rigoletto, before he overthrew him and took his place as the leader. Not only does he have big arms, but he also has a very big brain, as he is intellectually formidable, a master tactician, and is self-educated to university graduate level in the field of political science. Now, while Vincent D'Onofrio is a big guy, he is somewhat smaller than the typical comic book version of the character, with Kingpin normally standing at 6 feet and 7 inches at a massive weight of 450 pounds. But despite what you might think, that's not actually fat, it's all muscle. Because of Fisk's relentless training, he only has 2% body fat. Okay, so to put that into perspective, Cristiano Ronaldo has 7% body fat, Chris Hemsworth while playing Thor has around 10 to 15% body fat, while never mind, we don't need to talk about that. However, despite boasting only 2% body fat, to cut down his weight a bit, Fisk has turned vegan in the comics, which means he can no longer eat his perfectly made omelets. But just because Fisk is apparently not weapon enough already, he's also kitted out with a number of dangerous accessories. He often wears Kevlar armor underneath his trademark white suit. He wears an ornamental diamond stick pin that conceals compressed sleeping gas that is effective if sprayed into a victim's face, and he also carries around an obliterator cane, which is a walking stick that conceals a laser weapon that can vaporize a handgun or a person's head at close range. But because Fisk is old school, he often just opts to use his fists. As we sort of mentioned already, one of Fisk's driving motivations is his wife Vanessa, who, like Uncle Ben, has died many times in the comics. In fact, Fisk has actually killed her twice. Well, sort of. After her death, the Hand resurrected her as a zombie assassin to kill the Kingpin, thinking that he wouldn't want to lay a hand on her, but he apparently had no qualms in killing his zombie wife. He killed her again during the clone conspiracy, where the Jackal created a clone of her, only for Fisk to realize that she was a shell of the woman that he loved and ended up snapping her neck. You know, like he does. But just because Wilson Fisk is the most memorable Kingpin, that doesn't mean that he's been the only one in the comics. In fact, the Kingpin from Earth-65, the reality that Spider-Gwen is from, is none other than Fisk's main adversary, Matt Murdock. Yeah, no matter how you look at it, it just doesn't feel right. As you know, Kingpin often finds himself squaring up against Daredevil and Spider-Man, but he also has gone up against multiple other Marvel characters, such as Captain America, Wolverine, and the Red Skull, who he beat by falling on and crushing him under his weight during a boxing match. But one of the most interesting people he went up against was Jessica Jones's villain, Killgrave, aka the Purple Man. Famously, the Purple Man can control people's minds, but when he ordered Fisk to shoot himself in the head, because Fisk's willpower is so strong, his simple and badass response was, "No, I give the orders now." That is some serious Captain Phillips vibes right there. In terms of Wilson's son, Richard, the apple doesn't fall very far from the tree, with Richard Fisk ultimately becoming the vigilante and killer known as the Rose. During his comic book tenure, the Rose has partaken in many different criminal schemes, most of which are directed at Spider-Man, but even at his own father from time to time. As one of Marvel's most notorious villains, Fisk has done some pretty dark and ruthless things in the comics. After learning that Peter Parker was a high school student, he arranged to have Midtown High School blown up. He had Aunt May shot by a sniper, which led to one of the most controversial Spider-Man stories of all time, One More Day. He abducted J. Jonah Jameson to get him to stop publishing articles at the Daily Bugle about New York City's criminal underworld. And when the throat of his son was slashed during a home invasion, he turned to his wife and said, "We'll have another one." But the most infamous case of Fisk being ruthless comes from the brilliant Born Again story, where Fisk learns of Daredevil's identity and begins systematically destroying his life, with many innocent civilians finding themselves in the crossfire. Now, this entry has spoilers for Hawkeye, so skip it if you're not all caught up. The Hawkeye storyline involving Echo and her uncle Fisk is very similar to a storyline in the comics, although it has been somewhat altered. In the comics, while in Japan, Fisk manipulates Maya Lopez, or Echo, into thinking that Daredevil killed her biological father, although Fisk was actually responsible, in order to incite Daredevil's death. But it ends up backfiring in an ironic way. After finding out the truth, Maya immediately attacked Fisk, furious at his betrayal, and shot him in both eyes, leaving him blind, just like his rival. But, luckily for Fisk, in the comics, double eye transplants are a thing, so he got his sight back. While he may be best known as Daredevil's main rival, he was never intended to be an antagonist for the Man Without Fear. Daredevil's original main villain was Leland Owlsley, aka the Owl, who had a penchant for eating mice and drinking expensive wine and didn't offer up much else. The reason Fisk became Daredevil's main villain was through the insistence of the legend Frank Miller, who also made the stories grittier and darker. Now, we mentioned it earlier, but Fisk becomes the Kingpin after dethroning his former boss Rigoletto, but to actually become the Kingpin himself, he needed a little help from an unlikely source, the Punisher. As Frank Castle systematically destroyed the gangs of New York, Fisk pitched the idea of creating the myth of a Kingpin figure so Punisher would expend his energies on tracking down this fictional character. In actuality, Fisk allowed Punisher to hunt down and kill Rigoletto's men one by one, allowing him to become the big man with his competition removed. As we said, Fisk likes to walk the line between being a gangster and a legitimate businessman, and because the guy is so power-hungry, it's no surprise that he eventually turned his sights to governing. So he eventually ran for mayor of New York, as his popularity had increased after Hydra were defeated after they invaded Manhattan. Fisk, after rigging the election, eventually won, and deciding to keep his friends close and his enemies even closer, hired Matt Murdock as deputy mayor to keep a close eye on him. The only problem was that shortly after becoming mayor, Fisk ended up in a coma after being attacked by the Hand, meaning Murdock temporarily took his place. Despite being driven by power and greed, even people like Fisk have their limits, and after eventually burning out, like James Bond, he decides to retire, heading out to Spain to live a quiet, peaceful life. He even ended up settling down, falling in love with a woman named Marta and moving in with her and her kids, where he tries to bury his demons and live a normal life. But of course, this doesn't last long, and you can only outrun your demons for so long. He came home one day to find Marta and her children had been murdered by the Hand, which eventually leads Fisk to return back to New York and become the Kingpin once again. And finally, Fisk actually inspired an admittedly bleak invention in the real world. In the 1979 story, The Kingpin's Midnight Massacre, Fisk plants a tracer on Spider-Man so he can easily locate the wall crawler. A judge called Jack Love read this comic and thought Kingpin's tracker was such a brilliant idea, it should be implemented into reality, and thus the electronic tag was created.
What are you waiting for? Finish it.